summer day, and this is a true story.
You guys ever thought about joining a sorority?
I promise to let any of my senior sisters. I promise to let any of my senior sisters into my bed whenever they want. I think do you have this diary? Yes. What your mom wants.
You must be Summersmith. I've heard so much about you. She wants me to leave tonight. She put a I'm on knees with you. Cheers to me. Would you be also sister? Not something else. Let's go. You stood up to your mom and it was just so what did you say?
I like the legend.
I don't think a legend, but my friend is coming from Akron tomorrow. Her mom passed away
A while ago, and it's
been our mentor for our thing.
they only have one bed, so obviously Violet's gonna stay with me, and Jenna, you can stay with Taylor.
Scene 4 shifts away from the earlier sorority-centered material and opens with a quieter conversation about friendship, anticipation, and the arrival of Violet, a 23-year-old friend traveling from Akron. Reagan speaks with unmistakable excitement about seeing her, explaining that Violet is coming with another friend because she does not drive, and that the trip will take 6 or 7 hours. The length of the journey emphasizes how meaningful the visit is. This is not a casual encounter, but a reunion with someone whose presence matters deeply. Reagan also explains that there is an age difference between them, but frames the relationship through mentorship and care. Violet's mother died sometime earlier, and Reagan has taken on a supportive role, helping Violet with things her mother could no longer teach her. That detail gives their relationship an emotional foundation before any romantic possibility enters the story. Reagan is not simply describing a younger acquaintance. She is describing someone she feels responsible for, someone whose growth she has witnessed, and someone whose return makes her genuinely happy. The scene therefore begins by presenting intimacy through friendship, guidance, and chosen family language. This matters because queer stories often show women building networks of care outside traditional family structures, especially when biological relationships are complicated by loss, distance, or misunderstanding. The conversation then turns toward a more delicate issue when another person, Armana, reportedly saw Reagan and Lena holding hands. The revelation is presented as something that might look questionable on a college campus, even though Reagan insists the gesture was ordinary within her circle. She explains that she holds hands with her sisters naturally and does not regard the gesture as inherently romantic. Yet the discussion recognizes that the same action can be interpreted differently by outsiders. Reagan acknowledges that school culture, personal upbringing, and social assumptions can cause innocent affection between women to be misread. This becomes one of the scene's most important ideas. Women do not always control the meanings assigned to their relationships. A simple gesture can become evidence in someone else's imagination, forcing women to monitor themselves even when they have done nothing wrong. For queer women, that pressure has an additional resonance because ordinary affection can become entangled with assumptions about sexuality, while genuine romantic affection can simultaneously be dismissed as merely friendship. The result is a strange double bind in which lesbian intimacy may be overinterpreted in some contexts and erased in others. Reagan ultimately agrees to be more careful about holding hands on campus, not because she believes the affection is wrong, but because she understands the social environment around her. Her decision illustrates the quiet emotional labor involved in navigating visibility. She wants to preserve her freedom to express affection, yet she also wants to protect herself and her friends from gossip or judgment. The scene then moves into ordinary academic conversation, which provides a useful contrast to the more personal material. The women discuss a science project concerning the cleanliness of dogs' mouths compared with humans, along with experimental difficulties involving samples and laboratory equipment. Another student discusses her own project, and the conversation eventually turns to dinner plans. These details may seem mundane, but they humanize the characters. Their lives are not defined exclusively by sexuality or relationship drama. They are students, friends, researchers, diners, and people making plans. That ordinariness strengthens the film's potential queer reading because it places women's relationships within everyday life rather than treating lesbian identity as a separate universe. The group decides to eat at a favorite Italian restaurant, discussing dishes, vegetarian preferences, and cheese pizza. They also make sleeping arrangements because Violet will be staying with Reagan while another friend stays elsewhere. Reagan says she is happy to have Violet's company, reinforcing the emotional warmth established at the beginning. The visit becomes a form of chosen family. People share food, conversation, living space, memories, and practical support. This is particularly significant because Violet's relationship with Reagan originated in a context of loss. Reagan's mentorship appears to have filled a gap without pretending to replace Violet's mother. Instead, the relationship offers continuity, instruction, and companionship. Later, the conversation becomes more personal as Reagan asks Violet about her father. Violet says they are becoming closer, and she describes making a recipe Reagan had previously taught. The exchange is affectionate and ordinary, showing how mentorship works through small acts of transmission. A recipe becomes more than food. It is evidence that knowledge can travel between people and strengthen family relationships. Reagan appreciates the effort, and the exchange suggests that Violet is carrying forward lessons she has received while also building her own independence. The tone remains playful, with teasing and tickling, until the subject of romantic relationships arises. Violet says she does not have a boyfriend and has simply not met anyone. Reagan responds with admiration, calling her beautiful and expressing surprise that she is unattached. At this point, the scene begins to shift from friendship toward questions of self-understanding. Reagan asks whether Violet is taking care of herself, initially using the phrase in a general sense before clarifying that she means personal and sexual well-being. The conversation is awkward, and Violet is hesitant to discuss it. That hesitation can be read through the broader theme of social conditioning. Violet has learned from Bible school that certain forms of private self-knowledge are wrong, leaving her uncertain about her own body and boundaries. The scene therefore introduces a conflict between inherited shame and personal autonomy. Rather than presenting self-discovery as scandalous, the story frames it as a process of learning to inhabit one's own life without fear. From a queer perspective, this is especially resonant because many LGBTQ+ women grow up receiving messages that discourage honest conversations about desire, relationships, and identity. Even when those messages are not explicitly anti-gay, they can create an atmosphere in which desire itself feels embarrassing or dangerous. Violet's uncertainty becomes a symbol of that larger cultural silence. Reagan positions herself as someone who can offer reassurance and practical guidance, but this is also where the scene becomes ethically complicated. Their age difference, mentorship history, and emotional dependence create a power imbalance that cannot simply be ignored. Reagan has described herself as someone who teaches Violet what her mother could not, and Violet clearly values her approval. That means any intimate development between them carries additional responsibility. The narrative invites viewers to notice the difference between supportive mentorship and influence that might become coercive. This distinction is essential to an emotionally grounded reading. Lesbian intimacy is not automatically wholesome merely because it involves women, and queer storytelling becomes stronger when it acknowledges consent, boundaries, and unequal positions of authority. The scene's emotional core therefore lies not in the physical details of what follows, but in the question of whether Violet is genuinely choosing her own path or simply responding to someone she trusts. The dialogue repeatedly emphasizes trust and relaxation, yet the surrounding circumstances complicate those assurances. For queer viewers, that tension can be recognizable because coming into one's identity often involves learning to distinguish authentic desire from the desire to please someone who appears more experienced or confident. Reagan's role as mentor can be comforting, but it can also make her words unusually powerful. The scene would be most compelling when interpreted as a study of that ambiguity rather than as a straightforward fantasy of discovery. Violet's journey toward self-recognition is significant because she begins from uncertainty. She has not met a partner, she has absorbed restrictive teachings, and she seems unsure how to talk about her own needs. The conversation gradually creates a vocabulary for self-care. The underlying message is that caring for oneself should not be a source of shame. That idea extends beyond sexuality. Women are frequently taught to prioritize school, family, relationships, and other people's expectations while treating their own needs as secondary. The scene pushes against that pattern by making self-knowledge part of adulthood. For women broadly, this can resonate as a story about learning to ask what feels right rather than simply following rules inherited from family, religion, or culture. For queer women specifically, however, the stakes can be higher because self-knowledge may include recognizing feelings that have previously been dismissed, renamed, or hidden. The earlier hand-holding conversation establishes an important parallel. In that exchange, women worry that outsiders will assign a meaning to their affection. Here, Violet is learning that she also has the right to determine the meaning of her own inner life. Both moments concern interpretation, who gets to define women's relationships, and who gets to define women's desires. The scene suggests that authentic identity requires reclaiming that authority. It also complicates the idea of chosen family. Chosen family can be a vital source of support for queer people, but supportive relationships still require boundaries. Reagan's connection with Violet is meaningful precisely because it contains care, history, and trust, yet those qualities also make the power dynamic more consequential. A mentor can become a confidant, and a confidant can become emotionally significant. But the transition between roles should be handled thoughtfully. The scene's strongest contribution is therefore its emphasis on conversation and recognition rather than spectacle. Even though the source material contains explicit material, the emotional framework surrounding it is about a young woman confronting shame and learning to see herself as someone worthy of care. That framework can be discussed without reproducing the explicit content. The story asks, what happens when a person who has been taught to avoid self-knowledge begins to approach herself with curiosity instead of fear? It also asks how another woman's support can help that process while reminding us that support must not become control. The film's broader social context remains important. Women's intimacy has often been either trivialized or sensationalized, particularly when the women involved are queer. One cultural response is to pretend that close female relationships are always merely friendship. Another is to treat lesbian attraction as inherently provocative. Both approaches flatten women's interior lives. A more thoughtful reading recognizes that affection, longing, admiration, mentorship, and romantic interest can overlap without becoming interchangeable. The scene's everyday details help resist sensationalism. Food, school projects, family reconciliation, travel, pets, and jokes occupy much of the conversation. These ordinary elements make the characters feel like people first. Their emotional lives develop inside ordinary routines rather than outside them. That is one reason the material can resonate with LGBTQ+ viewers seeking representation that does not reduce lesbian identity to conflict or spectacle. The scene also illustrates how women may carry emotional labor for one another. Reagan remembers Violet's history, teaches her practical skills, worries about her well-being, and celebrates her progress with her father. Violet, in turn, brings affection and enthusiasm into Reagan's life. Their relationship is reciprocal in some ways, even though their roles are not equal. This distinction matters. A relationship can contain genuine mutual care while still having unequal power. Recognizing both truths makes the analysis more realistic and avoids turning queer intimacy into either pure fantasy or pure cautionary tale.